We've got people that we need to employ in our salt works in Whyalla and northern Queensland. So, it's my job just to make sure that, that they have a job and they've got a family to feed as well. So it's falls on my shoulders to keep those machines running and those people employed. So I had no choice. You've got to hustle like you're broke.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Salt, an essential part of cooking that not only enables produce to reveal its full potential, it is an ingredient all on its own. There are many types of salt that all have their own flavour and character. With the heavy impact of the pandemic on the hospitality and aviation sectors, what has happened to those producing high quality salt that normally goes to restaurants and catering companies? Alex Olsson and her family have been producing Olsson salt since 1948. Alex, how are you going?
I'm doing well. How are you, Hux?
I'm good. With salt being such an essential ingredient for a lot of cooking, particularly in restaurants and food service and with airlines, what sort of impact have you seen during this period of time?
Yeah, in the initial phases of the initial lockdowns, we saw the same percentages as most suppliers to the food service industry. So we saw an 80% loss virtually immediately, and that was into restaurants, hotels, catering, and airlines. But because salt covers so much of the food industry, we that sector for us is relatively modest compared to our traditional salt business in manufacturing, and we've seen a lot of increases in food manufacturers using our salt, and I think that's probably because of the pandemic as well. Whereas if people have struggled to get international foodstuffs, they've gone back to Australian foodstuffs, which is, on the whole, a good thing. But yes, definitely that high end of town, restaurants, catering, and airlines. Airlines was 100% gone, like many of our fellow food manufacturers. But hopefully it won't be too long before we can get on the planes.
There was something you mentioned there about people using local produce more. There's a lot of the salt that we eat isn't actually from Australia, but during this time we've seen a reverse of that because of the situation. Can you tell us about that?
I don't really know what the volumes are coming from overseas, but I do know that we've experienced a sharp increase in consumers buying from us directly via our website. Both Pepe Sayer and I noticed we pivoted pretty quickly, being sort of family-owned businesses, the health of the business isn't on how fast you can change and move with the times. So we did a nice quick step and sort of tried to move as much business we could over to the retail sector, and that's really worked for us. The Australian consumers certainly have come on board and using it a lot more. But I don't know what the import status is on things like Malden and Sel de Guerin and some of the Cypriot salt, but we're certainly doing some good business with our domestic market in terms of retail products.
Well, can you tell us about the process of making your Australian sea salt? How long does it take?
It depends where you are, and it depends predominantly on the weather. Our salt works in Whyalla make salt relatively quickly, that is to say between 9 and 12 months. But our salt works up in northern Queensland sometimes takes a little bit longer, and that's mainly because of the tropical cyclones which dump meters and meters of water, fresh water, back on the salt pans, which sort of dilutes the salt back again.
Can you take us through the process of actually making salt? What's involved?
Well, sea salt is a bit different to like mine salt, like the stuff you get from Pakistan. We take seawater from just off the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef in our northern Queensland saltworks, and the Great Australian Bight or Spencer Gulf down in our Whyalla saltworks. And we capture those in what we call primary ponds, and that feeds a succession of ponds, and the salt gets more and more heavy in salt as the water evaporates. To make really good sea salt, you need to be in places that have really high winds, and Whyalla is perfect because it's got about 300, minimum of 300 days of sunshine a year and lots of wind. And that whips up the water. It creates a greater surface area for the sun to evaporate the water. And then it finally goes into once the old fellas who sort of manage the waters, they can sort of see that the salt is ready to drop out of the water, and then the water, that heavy brine, is fed into crystallizer pans, and then the salt drops out of the water, and it's beautiful. It's lovely to see. I'd love to have you down there one day and watch the salt crystals fall out of the water from the top to the bottom and forming lovely crystals and beautiful sea salt.
Well, I have seen amazing photography of this, and the water looks pink. Why is that?
It's a range of microorganisms that contain something called beta carotene, and that's the basic color component of things like pink flowers or carrots, and it proliferates in marine bacteria, and it's eaten by things like brine shrimp, and also, funnily enough, flamingos, because that's what turns the flamingos pink. And it proliferates in heavy brine, and that turns it pink. Our salt's not pink though. It is a living organism. This this microorganism with beta carotene that makes the beta carotene the pink or the orange, and so it doesn't survive the dry salt. It has to be a brine or a wet solution for the little bacteria or microorganisms to live. So once we take the salt out of the water, it immediately is white. So the pink doesn't stick to it. But anyway, it's delicious. It's just not pink.
You produce salt in different regions of Australia, and we're talking about how the flavour and character is in different salts. How do you explain the flavour and character of salts? And do they differ with the ones that you produce?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Huck. A lot of people, when they talk to me about salt, they, say, "Oh, isn't salt just salt?" And being a bit of a smart mouth, I always go, "Oh, well, yeah, isn't beef just beef, and isn't wine just wine?" But of course, it's not, because, these things like beef, wine, and olive oil, they're quite complex structures, and salt's really simple. It's sodium chloride, NaCl, and so I like to compare it to water or mineral water. And salt, if it's a natural product, should have character. It should talk about where it's from with its mineral components, whether it's marine mineral or terrestrial minerals. Our salt tastes like the ocean. And it should taste like the ocean, when it's not over processed. And we do nothing to our salt. Like, we literally take it out of the heavy brine, wash it in seawater just to sort of get any dust and stuff that's sort of fallen from the environment. We wash it with seawater and we dry it. That's it. So all of those beautiful components that make it super tasty are still in the salt. When you get salt manufacturers that over-process, and I don't know what that process is. I don't have any knowledge of how you would do that, but I've heard people say that, people use bleach with their salt to make them whiter, and, there's this long processing. You can denature salt of the marine minerals or any minerals around it to make it just sodium and chloride, but it becomes quite bland and boring. It doesn't have any character. It doesn't have any provenance. And water is the same way. If you denature water of all the minerals that are contained in it, you get something that it's not a tasty thing. When you have beautiful spring water that comes, directly out of mountain springs, it tastes delicious. And that's all the minerals and trace elements that make it delicious. But if you take all of those out, you get something that might be wet, but it doesn't have any flavour. It doesn't have any character. Salt's the same way.
Can you tell us the difference between table salt and sea salt? Because that's the common sort of that you see on the market in the supermarket shelves?
Yeah, we have what we call sea salt. Sea salt is a grade of salt or a particular crystal size with very tight specifications. Um, and it can be sea salt, it can be river salt or lake salt, it can be mine salt, like, you know, the salt you get from Pakistan, it can be a whole range of salt. It just hits um, those specifications dictated by food standards within a country. Often you'll find that to make it pour well and to make it sit on the shelf, there are particular chemicals that can be added to it, and you'll often find that there's not a lot of love sitting around those very inexpensive products like you would expect. Obviously, you know, if we've gone to the trouble of making a beautiful salt, you know, it takes time and it takes effort, and sometimes cheaper products don't sort of reflect the love and attention that are put into them in terms of their price.
You've done a lot of projects with food producers as well, and when Giovanni Pilu began producing Bottega in Australia, I know you were involved. What did it take to create something for the process of Bottega?
That was great. You know, spending time with Kondomitsis and Giovanni Pillo is always going to be so much fun. They're such charming men. Giovanni is from Sardinia, and he wanted a salt that was like the salt they found in Sardinia, but he wanted an Australian salt. So I made a bespoke salt for him. I made it. We went through we went through a lot of versions, but we did some salt from our South Australian pans mixed with the heavy marine mineral salt from northern Queensland. And I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you. That formula. But we finally found, we did some percentages of each, and he finally said, no, this is exactly what I would get in Sardinia. So he wanted to make an authentic Bottega, but with 100% Australian ingredients, and with Con's know-how and our salt, it's a beautiful, authentic Bottega, but with, you know, with 100% Australian ingredients, which is a beautiful thing.
You've also developed some great relationships with other chefs and restaurants, and you've even produced a smoked salt with Ross Lusted. Can you tell me about that?
Oh, that was a lot of fun too. Yeah, Ross and Charlie Costello from Pialago. Um, Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. It took a lot longer because it was just a concept. We wanted a smoked salt, and I kind of wanted an Australian. By the way, it was smoked salt for Australian. Don't use wattle barks if you're trying to smoke something because it's poisonous, and I learnt the hard way. Pretty crook for a couple of days after I tried that one. But yeah, we used to.
Wow.
It's yeah, who knew? A lot of people apparently, except not me at the time. We yeah, so we settled on red gum because it is readily available. Red gum's readily available. We went through a couple of nut woods and a couple of American woods, but you know, I really wanted something different. And Ross, who's worked in the States, you know, loves that smoky flavour. And we were just lucky enough to know Charlie down in Pialago Smokehouse, who was happy to come on that journey with us. And you know, Ross has a peerless palate, and he knew exactly what he wanted in his head. But it's really hard to sort of say what you need if it's just a sort of a concept. So we went through a lot of versions of what we needed, and I was going, oh no, not another 12 hours, Charlie, not another 12 hours, what's going on here? You know, another 12, and then Ross would go, no, another 12, and I'd be terrified, quaking in my boots, going, Charlie, could you do another 12 hours? No, I can't do another bloody 12 hours. But it was, in the end, we got to 3 full days, we got 72 hours, and then Ross went, yes,
Wow.
that'll do. So it was good fun. But again, wonderful men and such fun.
We've seen our culinary landscape change quite dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. What's it been like from your perspective with salt? Has our understanding of salt changed in that time?
Oh, absolutely. I think, um, when about 20 years ago things started to change, there was a few there was a few producers back then, but Australian producers have really only been applauded for their provenance in the last 20 years. Whereas you go to Switzerland and and France and Italy and Spain, and they have those areas that specifically make one thing. Whether it's jamon iberico, or whether it's grana padano, or going to France and having the appellation controlled appellation areas. And so they've had hundreds of years to develop these systems and pride in their produce, and the population applauds the producer gets better and feels the love. But it's only really been, and there might be a couple of exceptions, but it really has only been the last 20 years where Australian producers have started to feel as though they have permission to be that artisanal producer. And you see it, look, there's just too many now to name them, but there's just some wonderful products, and be it cheese um, or or beef or lamb. These people producing very specific, delicious food. And luckily, it was the right time. Now we've got the chefs who use that and only use those things and are proud to use those things and tell people about it. Yeah, good time to be in Australia.
Your family has been producing salt since 1948. How did it all start?
Well, we actually started producing salt blocks for sheep and cattle in 1948. It wasn't until 1954 that we bought our leases in Waruka, in a place called the Peasy Swamp. Who doesn't want salt from the Peasy Swamp, Hux? I know I do. But it was pretty low grade salt. It was pretty low grade salt, and it was to as an ingredient, the main ingredient in these salt blocks, and that was during the last really big drought, lasted from the mid 1940s to early 1950. And that's when Australia was riding on the sheep's backs, when we were actually, the country was making its money from merino wool. So these animals needed to be kept alive. And the way you can do that is by putting minerals and trace elements into salt blocks to help the animal. It doesn't keep them alive, but what it does is it helps them eat dry feed. It improves that mineral balance in what's called a rumen, because cattle and sheep are ruminants. They have that big fermentation tank before their stomachs, and they eat the food. The minerals help to feed the bacteria that's in the rumen, and then when those bacteria that can digest the feed proliferate, then they can eat more food, and that keeps those animals alive. And that's and then some things happen, and so we needed to steady our supply of salt, or not we, because I wasn't born then. But my grandfather and father bought the leases on what was then Pacific Salt on the Peasy Swamp in the Yorke Peninsula of South Australia, and then we were offered the salt works, the old BHP salt works in Whyalla, and we moved our salt production in 1970 up to there.
The pandemic has not only affected the hospitality sector, but the aviation sector has been decimated, and we're still unsure of when we'll fly overseas again. But you're the official salt supplier of Qantas in business and first class. That must have been a pretty proud moment.
So proud.
How did that relationship start?
So proud. I love telling people that. I still love it. I'm so stinking proud to be that person. It's like literally the best thing. You can hear that you've already put a smile on my face just by saying that. But it is just amazing. We have been around for a while, but as far as I know, we're the first people in the world to have our brand on board our national carrier, a national carrier. So I think it's actually a first for the world.
Wow, how did that relationship start?
Well, as all good relationships do, Hux, I was at one of the Pepe Sayer events, at Butterball's events, and he introduced me to Roger Barstow. And Roger has left Qantas, but he was one of the chefs there, and he was doing some procurement. But it took a number of years for us to get on board. They're a very exacting company. They really only want the very, very best, and they go to a lot of trouble to get it as well. And then more recently, I've been talking to some other people. Roger has sort of moved over to another company now, but We've been dealing with the procurement crew from Qantas, a guy called David Speck, who's just awesome. And getting that across the line and doing as much as we can. It's, but they've taken such a massive hit. I don't know how they're going to look when they finally do some wheels up, but yeah, it'd be hard going, huh?
Your product is at the high end. For the high end, it's a high quality, amazing salt. But a lot of people have salt in bowls at home, open to air. And do you have some tips on the handling and use of salt at home?
Well, I mean, winter is okay, but Australia's a pretty humid place. Salt is hygroscopic, which means it draws water into itself, and that's because seawater, sea salt comes from water. So things want to be what they were meant to be. So all sea salt really just wants to be seawater again. So it'll absorb any moisture that's in the air around it all the time, unless it's ultra dried. And so you've actually sort of stopped that natural chemical a tendency for it to absorb moisture. You take every bit of moisture out and every mineral attached to it, so you get a totally denatured salt. But we don't have the machinery for that. We're pretty low tech at Olsson's. So all of our salt will absorb moisture if given the opportunity. All I can say is just keep your lids on, folks. It's as simple as that. And not the salt's fine. If it gets a bit wet, it's perfectly fine. It's just a little bit wet. I mean, if you're breathing in the air that has moisture in it and some of the salt breathes it in as well, surely that's okay.
There are a lot of salts imported into Australia, but I understand you're beginning to reverse the trend and export Olsen salt to the world.
Yeah, well, that came to a screeching halt earlier this year. I was literally about to get on a plane to fly to Europe to start the process of setting up a distribution over there, and yeah, well, that didn't. Oh, COVID-19 put a spanner in that, but we've done a little bit of export, Singapore and some of that Southeast Asian region, as well as Japan. And of course, our great friend Monty from Icebergs has opened a little restaurant in LA called Soul Strings of Life, and he's hooked me up with a distributor in the US, which is, even though COVID's really knocked them around over there, it's doing quite well. Online sales are doing well in the States. So, my great wish is to let Europe buy some of our salt. God knows we've been doing it. We've been buying salt from them for so long. Surely they'd like to return the favour sometime soon.
You mentioned earlier that you had to pivot quite quickly into a retail sort of model and move into those markets a bit. With what's this period of time been like, and will this shift continue beyond COVID?
It's hard to tell. I don't have a crystal ball, but it was, we've got machinery and we've got people that we need to employ in our salt works in, Whyalla and northern Queensland. So, it's my job just to make sure that, that they have a job and they've got a family to feed as well. So it falls on my shoulders to keep those machines running and those people employed. So I had no choice. You've got to hustle like you're broke at that point. So working hard to turn that around, it worked quite well. I think, the atmosphere of staying at home and not having a lot to do, yeah, people did get online. And it's certainly, we're not back up to the sales numbers that we do, with restaurants and catering and airlines, but, we've recovered probably, 50 to 60% of that, which is pretty awesome in a short period of time. And, in the fullness of time, we probably would have always done that. But, you can never ignore an opportunity, when you're in business like this. You had no choice. You've just got to go hard. You think, well, this is a perfect opportunity. We're not getting the business through restaurants and hotels and catering. So that sector is closed completely. So you've got to hustle like you're broke. You've just got to work it. What do you have? What have we got now? And it's worked really well. And everyone's just been so supportive. I can't tell you seriously, the sales have been fantastic, and it's all Australian. and it's all people loving it. I'm thrilled and humbled at the same time. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Do you do a bit of cooking, and how do you use your salt? What's one of your favourite ways to use it in the kitchen?
I was speaking to Elizabeth Hewson earlier on this morning, and I switched her from table salt to using our marine mineral grey salt, which is the really high mineral one, to salt her pasta water, because it makes it taste like the ocean. It makes the water taste like ocean water, which is sort of the basis of salting your water when you cook pasta, is to make it like the ocean, like just, So that was so that's what I do. I salt my water with the marine grey salt, and that's made up in northern Queensland. And I was talking to somebody else about my father is an old bloke now, and very plain eater, very plain. He likes meat and potatoes, and so a bit of butter and the smoked salt on his potato. Oh, darling, that's great. That's really good, and that's lovely. I have very limited amounts of things that I could do. I've got a 11-year-old daughter who likes plain food like her grandfather, so it's generally just that Australian classics. Potatoes, meat, salad and vegetable. That's pretty much it. So, yeah, the salt goes down a treat. A little bit of flavour to those otherwise, simple foods.
What's this period of time been like for you personally? Has it changed you?
No, maybe. It's a bit hard to tell. Like when we went into isolation, I went home to the farm, and because there was no school, and a lot of my nephews and nieces came down to the farm as well, and that was great. I love that. I love cooking for them. That's like I'm living my best life. I absolutely loved cooking them. Lunch and dinner, and the farm crew was there. It was just fantastic. But I'm not sure it did. I've always been a hard worker. I've always instilled in my team that never let any opportunity go. And this was just almost like a textbook example of how you never let an opportunity go. And even though things can look bad, you've just got to make it better. There's no choice. You can't wallow. You've just got to make it better any way you can. And I do have an amazing team with me, and everyone has great, fantastic attitudes. And so it was a great way to exemplify a principle that I've always had, which is you work hard and you make any situation as best you can. And so that's where we stand. That's how we stand today. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that Europe have been sending their amazing salt to us for a long time, and your dream would be to get Australian salt into Europe when the borders open up again and we're on planes, and it sounds like you might be on the first plane over there. What are you going to say to pitch your Aussie salt to them?
I'm pretty sure it'll get lost in translation. I think they struggle here, listening to us. They go, "What is she saying?" But I'll do what I always done. I'll just work hard. I'll cold call chefs. I'll walk into hotels and ask to see the executive chef. Exactly what I did in Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan. I'll just keep on doing the same thing. And I'll say that to them. Surely it's time you bought some of our salt. Surely. Yeah. You can't be a shrinking violet when it comes to these sort of things. And it's served me well in the past.
Well, Alex, it's amazing to catch up with you. Keep in touch, and we've loved having you on Deep in the Weeds, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.